Would you explain the difference between a non-solicitation and a non-compete? Because there's quite a little difference there, correct? They're not the same thing.
There is, and correct. I kind of put everything under a restrictive covenant umbrella. So in my mind, when I say restrictive covenants, I'm encompassing confidentiality agreements, non-solicitation agreements of clients, non-solicitation agreements of employees, non-compete agreements, protection of intellectual property. You know, I'm including all of that kind of under the term restrictive covenant. But you're absolutely right, Martin. Those are all very, very specific terms that have very different purposes. In Oklahoma, a lot of times, I'm not sure where a lot of your listeners are, but in Oklahoma, I'll hear people constantly say, you know, non-competes aren't enforceable, so we can't have that. That's true. There is a statute in Oklahoma that, you know, says that the courts are not to enforce traditional non-compete agreements because it prohibits employees from engaging in their work. A non-compete agreement is saying you can't leave my company and go work for a competitor to me. So a lot of times, because that employee is trained to do the job for you, and so the courts in Oklahoma at least say you can't prohibit them from going and doing that job for a competitor. Most of the time, though, what clients are really seeking is not a non-compete, it's actually a non-solicit, where I'm okay if they go work for a competitor. I mean, I'm not going to be happy, I've invested in them and trained them, but I'm not prohibiting them from going to work for a competitor, but I need to prohibit them from taking information that they've learned from me. So the confidentiality piece, but then the big part, the non-solicit. So I don't want them to go work for the competitor and start calling up all their clients they deal with and try to get my clients to go to the competitor instead of working with me. You can prohibit that with a non-solicitation agreement. Similarly, I don't want them to go work across the street for my competitor and call up all their, their friends and their, good employees that I have that I've invested in, have them go work for the competitor, say, hey, they're paying us $1 more over here, come work over here. And so you can prohibit your employees from doing that as well. This is typically a separate document. An employee handbook probably will have a confidentiality provision in it, but the employee handbook is by name for employees. And, obviously there are confidentiality obligations as well as other fiduciary duties when they're employees, but this document encompasses not just during employment, but post-employment as well, which is really when you're concerned about those confidentiality obligations and non-solicitation obligations. As well, depending on the industry, if they're, developing certain process, if they're developing any sort of protected intellectual property for you, then obviously most companies where you have employees who are developing intellectual property are fairly savvy. And that's, their main concern when they get started is how do I protect this? I'm paying this employee to develop this information. I need to make sure this information is the company's information, not the employee's. But there may be, intellectual property your employees are doing that you're not fully aware of. And so it's helpful to at least have some of that language in that, confidentiality, non-solicitation agreement as well. So I know I kind of took a different angle to your question, but like I say, really the first call is not just let me develop an employee handbook, but it's let's get a plan in place so that we have what we need as a company in order to kind of grow our employee base and make sure that we're doing so in a responsible manner.
Yeah. I think there's so many contractors out there that don't have a contract in place for their employees or non-confidentiality agreement. And it's like, oh, I need that. I just hire them, I pay them, but it definitely gets a lot deeper than that.